History textbooks claim Ferdinand Magellan completed the first journey around Earth. But recent archaeological evidence from sites like San Julian Bay and analysis of Victoria artifacts reveals this is completely false. Magellan died halfway through the voyage in the Philippines and never saw Spain again. Only 18 survivors out of 270 original crew members actually finished the complete circumnavigation, all aboard the single surviving ship Victoria. Even more intriguing, research into the origins of Magellan's interpreter Enrique suggests he may have already completed a global journey over a year before the expedition returned to Europe. Who was this forgotten figure, and why has history overlooked his possible achievement? To understand this remarkable story, we must examine how a young Portuguese page would eventually abandon his homeland. The Portuguese court connection. Ferdinand Magellan entered King Manuel's court at Vila Real around 1492, when he was just 12 years old. This placement was no accident. Noble families strategically positioned their sons within the royal household to gain access to opportunities that could transform their futures. What nobody could predict was how this particular boy would use his privileged position to eventually serve Portugal's greatest rival. The Portuguese court operated as the nerve center of the world's most advanced maritime empire. Young pages like Magellan moved through chambers where admirals discussed trade routes and cartographers updated navigation charts. These boys served wine during meetings where captains reported on newly discovered islands and profitable spice markets. They carried messages between rooms where Portugal's expansion into Africa and Asia was planned down to the smallest detail. For an observant 12-year-old, the court provided an education in global strategy that no university could match. Magellan's daily responsibilities included copying official documents and organizing correspondence from distant territories. His handwriting became familiar with the coordinates of Portuguese trading posts stretching from Brazil to the Moluccas. He transcribed reports about wind patterns around the Cape of Good Hope and seasonal monsoons in the Indian Ocean. The boy learned to read nautical charts showing the locations of dangerous reefs and favorable harbors. Each document he copied added another piece to his mental map of Portuguese maritime dominance. Newly digitized court archives from 2025 reveal that Magellan had significant exposure to Portugal's exploration planning through his frequent map-handling duties. These documents show his name appearing regularly in records of pages responsible for organizing and maintaining the court's extensive collection of navigation materials. He delivered sealed reports from returning expedition commanders and helped catalogue charts showing established sailing routes between Europe and Portuguese colonies. This access exposed the young page to conversations about potential western routes to Asia, discussions that would later prove crucial to his own expedition planning. The political atmosphere in the Portuguese court during Magellan's formative years was charged with tension over Spain's growing maritime ambitions. Portuguese nobles spoke openly about their concerns regarding Christopher Columbus's discoveries and Spain's attempts to claim territories in the New World. Court conversations frequently turned to the Treaty of Tordesillas and debates over which lands rightfully belonged to Portugal versus Spain. Young Magellan absorbed these discussions about competing claims to global territories and trade routes. His page duties specifically included maintaining navigation instruments and organizing port-au-long charts. Magellan spent hours cataloging reports from pilots who had tested new passages around dangerous coastlines. The boy learned to identify different types of compass readings and understand how Portuguese navigators calculated their positions using celestial observations. This hands-on experience with navigation tools provided practical knowledge that complemented his theoretical education about ocean crossings and wind patterns. Court education shaped Magellan's understanding of navigation techniques that would prove essential during his later expedition. He learned to calculate distances using Portuguese methods for measuring ocean crossings. The boy studied how experienced captains estimated travel times based on wind patterns and seasonal weather changes. He observed discussions about provisioning ships for long voyages and managing crew morale during extended periods at sea. This knowledge would later enable him to plan and execute his own ambitious circumnavigation attempt. The court environment also exposed Magellan to the brutal realities of Portugal's colonial expansion. He copied reports describing violent encounters with local populations and the establishment of forced labor systems in Portuguese territories. The boy learned about the massive profits generated by controlling spice trade routes and the lengths Portugal would go to maintain its monopolies. This education in imperial economics taught him to recognize the potential value of discovering new passages to existing markets. Portuguese courtiers regularly discussed their concerns about Spanish attempts to find alternative routes to Asian markets. These conversations revealed Portugal's vulnerability if Spain succeeded in establishing its own direct access to the Spice Islands. Magellan heard detailed analysis of Spain's strengths and weaknesses in maritime exploration. He learned about Spanish navigational capabilities and their potential to compete with Portuguese dominance in global trade. His years as a court page concluded around 1505, when Magellan joined the Portuguese India fleet for active service. This transition from court observer to active participant would take him directly into Portugal's eastern expansion efforts. From 1505 to 1513, he served in the Portuguese fleet operations that established and maintained their Asian empire. During this period, particularly in 1511 at Malacca, Magellan purchased a young slave named Enrique, who would later play a crucial role in his circumnavigation attempt. This court experience established the foundation for Magellan's later strategic thinking. His privileged access to Portuguese planning gave him unique insights into his homeland's maritime operations and potential vulnerabilities. The young page had learned to think like a global strategist while copying documents and organizing maps. When King Manuel I later rejected his proposal for Western exploration, Magellan possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to take his expertise elsewhere. The Portuguese court had unknowingly trained someone who would eventually challenge their eastern monopoly by proving a western route was possible. But first, Magellan needed practical experience in long-distance ocean navigation and colonial operations. That education would come through direct participation in Portugal's most ambitious eastern expansion efforts. The Goa Expedition Revelation. Magellan's military service began with combat experience at Cananor in 1506, followed by the decisive naval battle at Dio in 1509, before he joined Afonso de Albuquerque's forces for the conquest of Goa in 1510. The Portuguese fleet that carried him to India faced one of the most dangerous ocean passages known to European sailors. The Cape of Good Hope had earned its reputation as a ship graveyard where violent storms and massive waves destroyed vessels attempting to round Africa's southern tip. Portuguese captains called this stretch of water the Cape of Storms before King John II renamed it to sound more encouraging to future expeditions. The 30-year-old Ferdinand Magellan stood on deck, watching enormous swells crash over the bow as his ship fought through the turbulent waters that separated the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Portuguese strategy for building their eastern empire required establishing a permanent foothold on India's west coast that could serve as a supply base for further expansion into Asia. Lisbon had identified Goa as the perfect location because of its natural harbors and strategic position along established trade routes between Arabia and Southeast Asia. The port city controlled access to the lucrative spice markets that European merchants desperately wanted to reach without paying inflated prices to Middle Eastern intermediaries. Capturing Goa would give Portugal direct control over the pepper and cinnamon trade that generated enormous profits for whoever controlled the shipping routes. Magellan served under Albuquerque during the systematic conquest of Goa, witnessing the brutal precision that would become the template for Portuguese colonization throughout the Indian Ocean. Albuquerque's forces surrounded the city and cut off all supply lines before launching coordinated attacks from both land and sea. The Portuguese commander ordered the execution of all Muslim defenders and forced the Hindu population into slavery or exile. Portuguese soldiers burned mosques and converted temples into Christian churches, while Albuquerque established Portuguese law over the conquered territory. Recent archaeological excavations at Goa's fort have revealed the massive scale of Portuguese construction projects that transformed the city into their eastern colonial headquarters. Ground-penetrating radar has identified the foundations of administrative buildings, military fortifications, and residential quarters that housed thousands of Portuguese colonists and their families. The archaeological evidence shows that Portugal invested enormous resources in creating a permanent European settlement that could support their expanding operations throughout Asia. Excavated artifacts include Portuguese coins, weapons, religious items, and household goods that demonstrate the extent of their commitment to establishing a lasting presence in India. Serving under Albuquerque provided Magellan with crucial experience in long-distance provisioning and naval logistics that would prove essential for his later circumnavigation attempt. He observed how Portuguese commanders calculated food and water supplies for journeys lasting several months without reliable opportunities for resupply. The expedition taught him about managing crew morale during extended periods at sea and dealing with diseases that spread rapidly in the confined spaces of sailing ships. Magellan learned how experienced navigators used celestial observations to determine their position when no familiar landmarks were visible for weeks at a time. The establishment of Goa as Portugal's eastern capital created a permanent base that supported Portuguese expansion throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. The city became the administrative center where Portuguese governors coordinated military campaigns, trade negotiations, and colonial policies across their growing Asian empire. Goa's strategic location allowed Portuguese fleets to control shipping routes between India, Malaysia, and the Spice Islands while providing a secure harbor where damaged ships could be repaired and crews could recover from long voyages. The success of this eastern expansion demonstrated Portugal's ability to project power across vast ocean distances and maintain control over profitable trade networks. Witnessing Portugal's success in establishing their eastern empire convinced Magellan that similar profits might be achieved by finding western routes to the same Asian markets. He calculated that sailing west across the Atlantic might provide faster access to the Spice Islands without the dangerous journey around Africa's southern coast. Magellan recognized that western routes would also avoid the established Portuguese bases in the Indian Ocean, where competing expeditions would face military opposition from his own countrymen. The young navigator began to envision an alternative approach that could reach the profitable spice markets while bypassing Portugal's existing eastern infrastructure. The Goa expedition also exposed Magellan to the enormous profits generated by controlling direct access to Asian spice markets. He witnessed Portuguese merchants selling pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon in European markets at prices that were 10 times higher than their purchase costs in Asia. The young navigator learned that transportation costs represented only a small fraction of the final selling price, meaning that anyone who could establish their own direct route to the Spice Islands could generate extraordinary wealth. This first-hand exposure to the economics of the spice trade motivated Magellan to search for alternative routes that could bypass Portuguese control over existing shipping lanes. Portuguese success in establishing Goa as their eastern headquarters planted the seed of an idea that would eventually lead Magellan to propose his western expedition to the Spanish crown. The expedition demonstrated that properly planned and supplied ocean voyages could generate enormous returns on investment while establishing lasting political control over distant territories. But first, Magellan's service would take him further east to an even more strategic location where Portugal was expanding their control over the spice trade. The discovery of Malacca in 1511 would provide the final piece of his education in global commerce and introduce him to someone whose origins would later become central to understanding the true story of the first circumnavigation. The Malacca slave market discovery. Ferdinand Magellan arrived in Malacca during 1511 as part of the Portuguese fleet that would transform this strategic port into the crown jewel of their Southeast Asian empire. The city represented everything that made the spice trade so profitable and so dangerous. Ships from China anchored beside vessels from India, while Arab merchants negotiated with Javanese traders in a cacophony of languages that created the soundtrack of global commerce. Portuguese sailors walked through markets where cinnamon from Ceylon sat next to nutmeg from the distant Moluccas and black pepper from the hills of southern India. The air itself seemed thick with the scent of profits that European monarchs would kill to control. This multicultural trading hub operated as the central nervous system of Asian commerce, where dozens of languages intersected in daily business transactions. Malay served as the common tongue that allowed merchants from different regions to communicate, but successful traders needed to understand fragments of Tamil, Arabic, Chinese, and various Indonesian dialects to navigate the complex negotiations that determined spice prices. Portuguese soldiers heard conversations switching between languages mid-sentence as traders adapted their speech to match whoever they were bargaining with at any given moment. The linguistic diversity created both opportunities and challenges for Portuguese administrators, who needed local interpreters to establish their colonial control over the existing trade networks. Portuguese forces moved quickly to establish military control over this crucial choke point that connected the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Albuquerque understood that whoever controlled Malacca could determine which ships gained access to the Spice Islands and at what cost. Portuguese cannons positioned along the harbour entrance could sink any vessel that attempted to bypass their new customs requirements. The strategic location allowed Portugal to collect taxes on virtually every spice shipment moving between Asia and the Middle East, while simultaneously blocking competitors from establishing their own direct relationships with spice producers in the Moluccas. The establishment of Portuguese Malacca created the perfect conditions for a slave market that would supply laborers for their expanding colonial operations throughout Southeast Asia. Portuguese colonists needed workers who could communicate with local populations and perform skilled tasks that required cultural knowledge beyond what European settlers possessed. Recent maritime archaeology from 2025 has uncovered evidence of the large-scale slave trade that operated through Malacca's markets, revealing the systematic nature of human trafficking that accompanied Portuguese colonial expansion. The archaeological findings show that thousands of individuals were processed through these markets during the first decades of Portuguese control. Ferdinand Magellan made a purchase in this slave market that would unknowingly alter the course of world history. The 14-year-old boy he bought was named Enrique, though this Portuguese name replaced whatever his family had called him before his enslavement. Portuguese records describe Enrique as speaking Malay fluently along with several other regional languages, suggesting he had grown up in a trading community where multilingual skills were essential for survival. The boy's linguistic abilities made him particularly valuable to Portuguese colonists, who needed reliable interpreters for their interactions with local populations across Southeast Asia. Enrique demonstrated remarkable ability to acquire Portuguese language skills during his early years of enslavement under Magellan's ownership. Portuguese observers noted that the boy could translate complex conversations between Portuguese officials and local merchants within months of his purchase. His rapid language acquisition suggested both natural linguistic talent and desperate motivation to become indispensable to his Portuguese masters. Enrique learned to read and write Portuguese, skills that elevated his status within the colonial hierarchy and provided him with knowledge that few enslaved individuals possessed. The master-servant relationship that developed between Magellan and Enrique would have consequences that neither man could have predicted when the purchase was completed in Malacca's slave market. According to Antonio Pigafetta's detailed expedition records, Enrique served as a paid interpreter whose linguistic abilities proved essential for communication with local populations. Pigafetta documented that Enrique spoke multiple languages fluently, making him invaluable for negotiations and cultural exchanges during their travels. The boy learned Portuguese military tactics, navigation techniques, and exploration strategies that would prove crucial during Magellan's later circumnavigation attempt. Pigafetta's vocabulary comparisons suggest that Enrique possessed knowledge of Cebuano and other Philippine languages, indicating possible origins from those islands rather than the Malaysian peninsula where Magellan purchased him. This linguistic evidence supports theories that Enrique might have been captured during raids on Philippine coastal communities and transported to Malacca's slave markets along with other captives from distant islands. The historical irony surrounding Enrique's purchase becomes clear when considering the possibility that this enslaved boy from Southeast Asia may have become the first person to complete a journey around the entire globe. While Magellan died in the Philippines and never completed his circumnavigation, Enrique continued with the expedition and witnessed the return to Spain. If the linguistic research confirming his Philippine origins proves correct, then Enrique would have traveled from his homeland to Europe with Magellan, then returned to the Philippines during the circumnavigation expedition. This would make an enslaved teenager, rather than a famous European explorer, the first human being to circle the planet Earth. Magellan's years in the East had provided him with invaluable experience in navigation, colonial administration, and global commerce. But his service in Portugal's Eastern Empire would soon create unexpected complications when he returned home with ambitious plans for Western exploration. The Great Betrayal of Portugal. Ferdinand Magellan returned to Portugal from his successful expeditions in the East, expecting royal recognition and advancement within the Portuguese maritime hierarchy. However, his relationship with King Manuel I gradually deteriorated as the monarch grew suspicious of Magellan's activities during his service in Southeast Asia. Portuguese court officials began questioning whether Magellan had engaged in unauthorized private trading that violated his military obligations, though these concerns developed over time rather than immediately upon his return. The growing tension between Magellan and the Portuguese crown would ultimately force him to make a decision that would change the course of world history. King Manuel I's court became increasingly unwelcoming toward Magellan as doubts mounted about his conduct in the Eastern Territories. The Portuguese monarch had built his reputation on maintaining strict discipline within Portugal's colonial administration and viewed any irregularities with deep suspicion. Magellan found himself excluded from planning sessions for future expeditions and denied the promotions that his experience and achievements should have warranted. Portuguese officials began treating him with growing coldness, making it clear that his future prospects within Portugal's maritime establishment were limited. Facing professional stagnation and seeking to restore his standing, Magellan developed a revolutionary proposal that he believed could advance Portugal's imperial ambitions while securing his own position. He presented King Manuel I with detailed plans for reaching the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean instead of following the established eastern route around Africa. Magellan argued that this western passage would provide Portugal with a faster and potentially more profitable alternative to their existing supply lines that required dangerous journeys around the Cape of Good Hope and across the entire Indian Ocean. His proposal included sophisticated calculations showing how western routes could reduce travel times to the Spice Islands while avoiding the established Portuguese infrastructure that required constant maintenance and defense against competing European powers. Magellan presented maps showing theoretical passages through or around the American continent that would provide direct access to the Pacific Ocean and the lucrative Asian markets beyond. He argued that Portugal could establish Western colonies that would complement their Eastern Empire while creating redundant supply lines that would protect against potential disruptions to their existing trade networks. King Manuel I made the fateful decision to reject Magellan's Western route proposal, dismissing it as too risky and potentially counterproductive to Portugal's established Eastern expansion strategy. The Portuguese monarch argued that Portugal's existing network of colonies and trading posts represented proven investments that required continued support rather than speculative alternatives that might drain resources from successful operations. King Manuel I's rejection demonstrated his conservative approach to imperial expansion and his preference for consolidating existing gains rather than pursuing untested strategies that carried significant risks of failure. The rejection devastated Magellan's hopes for advancement within the Portuguese system and convinced him that his homeland had made a strategic mistake by refusing to consider alternative approaches to reaching Asian markets. Portuguese archives reveal correspondence showing Magellan's growing frustration with what he viewed as short-sighted decision-making by Portuguese officials who failed to recognize the potential value of Western exploration. These documents demonstrate his increasing conviction that Portugal was missing a historic opportunity to expand their global dominance through innovative navigation strategies. Magellan made multiple unsuccessful petitions to King Manuel I throughout 1517, each time requesting reconsideration of his western route proposal or alternative assignments that would utilize his extensive experience in Asian waters. Portuguese court records show that these repeated requests were consistently denied, with officials citing concerns about resource allocation and strategic priorities that favored continued investment in established Eastern operations. The pattern of rejections made it clear that Magellan had no future within Portugal's maritime hierarchy, regardless of his past service or navigation expertise. The rejected navigator made his dramatic decision to renounce Portuguese citizenship in 1517, formally severing his ties to the homeland that had refused to support his revolutionary exploration plans. This renunciation represented an unprecedented act of defiance against the Portuguese crown and effectively branded Magellan as a traitor in the eyes of his former countrymen. Portuguese officials interpreted his citizenship renunciation as confirmation of their suspicions about his questionable loyalty and unreliable character. The formal break with Portugal eliminated any possibility of reconciliation and committed Magellan to finding alternative patrons for his Western expedition plans. Magellan undertook the risky journey to Seville, where he would present his proposal to Spain's Charles I, knowing that approaching Portugal's primary rival constituted an act of treason that could result in his execution if Portuguese agents captured him. The journey to Spanish territory required careful planning to avoid Portuguese surveillance and potential retaliation by agents loyal to King Manuel I. Magellan carried detailed maps and navigation charts that represented Portuguese state secrets, making his defection an intelligence opportunity for Spanish imperial planners who had long sought inside information about Portuguese exploration techniques and territorial claims. Charles I of Spain recognized the strategic value of gaining access to Asian markets through routes that would bypass Portuguese-controlled territories and trading posts. Spanish officials viewed Magellan's defection as an opportunity to challenge Portuguese dominance in global trade, while simultaneously advancing Spanish territorial claims in newly discovered regions of the world. The Spanish court approved Magellan's proposal and began assembling the resources necessary for an unprecedented Western expedition that would test whether the globe could be circumnavigated by ocean travel. This betrayal of Portugal created the conditions for history's first attempt at global circumnavigation, but the expedition that Charles I would authorize carried dangers that extended far beyond the perils of unknown oceans. Charles I of Spain granted Magellan 5 ships on March 22, 1518, but this fleet carried the seeds of its own destruction from the moment crews stepped aboard in Seville. Spanish sailors made no effort to hide their contempt for serving under a Portuguese commander who had betrayed his own homeland to serve their crown. The men questioned how they could trust someone who had abandoned Portugal when it suited his ambitions. Whispered conversations in taverns and aboard ship centered on fears that Magellan might betray Spain just as easily if circumstances changed during their voyage. These suspicions created an atmosphere of mistrust that poisoned relationships between officers and crew members before the expedition even departed Spanish waters. The Spanish crew's resentment toward their Portuguese commander intensified as they learned more about Magellan's background and his reasons for seeking Spanish patronage. Sailors discovered that their captain had faced questions about his conduct during service in Portuguese colonies, leading them to question whether Charles I had made a terrible mistake in trusting this foreign opportunist with Spain's resources and reputation. Spanish officers complained privately that qualified Spanish navigators should have received command of such an important expedition rather than a Portuguese exile with questionable loyalty. The crew interpreted Magellan's appointment as evidence that their king valued foreign expertise over Spanish competence and patriotism. Charles I ruled not only Spain but also the Holy Roman Empire, creating complex political pressures that influenced his decision to support Magellan's Western expedition despite the obvious risks of employing a Portuguese defector. The young monarch needed to demonstrate Spanish strength and independence from Portuguese dominance in global exploration, while simultaneously managing the competing demands of his European territories. Charles I recognized that successful Western routes to Asian markets could provide Spain with economic advantages that would strengthen his position in European politics and reduce Spanish dependence on Portuguese-controlled trade networks. His support for Magellan represented a calculated gamble that Western exploration could transform Spain into a global maritime power capable of competing with Portugal's Eastern Empire. Analysis of crew manifests completed in 2025 reveals the remarkable diversity of expedition members who joined Magellan's voyage from ports across Europe and North Africa. The 270 men included Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, Germans, French sailors, and even North Africans who brought different languages, customs, and loyalties aboard the 5 ships. This multinational composition created communication barriers and cultural conflicts that complicated Magellan's efforts to maintain discipline and unity among his crews. The diversity meant that officers needed to give orders in multiple languages while managing competing national interests and personal motivations that varied dramatically between different groups of sailors. Captain Juan de Cartagena emerged as the leader of Spanish opposition to Magellan's authority, using his position as Inspector General appointed by Charles I to question the Portuguese commander's decisions and undermine crew confidence in their leader. Cartagena argued that Spanish interests should take precedence over Magellan's personal ambitions, and that Spanish officers deserved greater influence over expedition planning and execution. His opposition would later manifest in documented plotting during their stop at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where Spanish resistance to Portuguese leadership began organizing into more serious challenges to Magellan's command authority. Letters discovered in Spanish archives and analyzed using 2025 digital restoration techniques reveal the depth of anti-Portuguese sentiment that infected the expedition from its earliest planning stages. Spanish nobles wrote to Charles I expressing concerns about entrusting Spanish lives and resources to a Portuguese exile whose motivations remained suspect despite his promises of loyalty to the Spanish crown. The correspondence shows that influential Spanish courtiers had opposed Magellan's appointment and predicted that his foreign origins would create discipline problems that could destroy the expedition's chances of success. These letters demonstrate that Spanish opposition to Portuguese leadership extended far beyond the sailors who would actually participate in the voyage. Portuguese King Manuel I responded to Magellan's defection by dispatching 2 caravels with orders to intercept the Spanish expedition and prevent his former subject from revealing Portuguese navigation secrets to Spain. These pursuit vessels added external pressure that complicated Magellan's internal problems with crew loyalty and increased the stakes for everyone. Aboard the Spanish expedition, Portuguese agents operating in Spanish ports gathered intelligence about the expedition's departure schedule and planned routes, creating security concerns that forced Magellan to implement additional secrecy measures. The threat of Portuguese interception meant that crew members faced potential capture and imprisonment if Portuguese forces succeeded in stopping the expedition before it could escape European waters. Research conducted in 2025 has revealed the diverse economic motivations that drove individual crew members to join Magellan's expedition despite the obvious risks and uncertain prospects for success. Analysis of financial records shows that some sailors joined because they faced debts or legal problems that made leaving Europe attractive, regardless of the expedition's ultimate destination. Other crew members were motivated by promises of shares in any profits generated by discovering new trade routes or territories that could be claimed for Spanish exploitation. The research demonstrates that crew loyalty depended largely on whether individual sailors believed the expedition would improve their personal financial situations, rather than abstract concepts of national service or exploration for scientific purposes. These internal divisions created by national tensions, economic pressures, and competing loyalties threatened to destroy Magellan's expedition before the ships could even reach the open Atlantic. The combination of Spanish resentment toward Portuguese leadership crew diversity that complicated communication and discipline, and external threats from Portuguese pursuit vessels established conditions where serious challenges to command seemed inevitable. As the expedition prepared for departure, Magellan faced the daunting task of maintaining authority over men who questioned his loyalty while managing political pressures that could turn crew members against each other. The success of his mission would depend on whether he could hold this fractured fleet together long enough to prove that western routes to Asia were possible. The Atlantic crossing and divine intervention. The 5 ships of Magellan's expedition departed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September 20, 1519, carrying 270 men into the Atlantic Ocean toward an uncertain destiny that would test their courage, faith, and loyalty in ways none of them could imagine. The Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago sailed out of Spanish waters with their crews still divided by the national tensions and personal conflicts that had plagued the expedition since its formation. Spanish sailors continued to question their Portuguese commanders' motives, while Magellan struggled to maintain authority over men who viewed him as a foreign opportunist rather than a legitimate leader worthy of their respect and obedience. The first major challenge to Magellan's authority erupted at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where Captain Juan de Cartagena openly voiced his displeasure with the Portuguese commander's decisions and began organizing Spanish opposition to foreign leadership. Cartagena used his position as Inspector General appointed by Charles I to question Magellan's route choices and navigation techniques, arguing that Spanish officers possessed superior knowledge of Atlantic sailing conditions. The confrontation at Tenerife demonstrated the depth of Spanish resentment toward Portuguese command and established patterns of resistance that would plague the expedition throughout their journey toward the American coast. Violent Atlantic storms near the equator transformed the ocean into a terrifying battlefield where massive waves crashed over the ship's decks and hurricane-force winds threatened to tear their sails apart. The weather deteriorated rapidly as the fleet encountered a series of storms that battered the armada and forced the ships to lower their sails to prevent catastrophic damage to their rigging. Crew members who had signed up for adventure and profit found themselves fighting for survival against natural forces that seemed determined to destroy their expedition before it could achieve any of its ambitious goals. The storms tested every aspect of their seamanship while demonstrating how quickly oceanic conditions could shift from manageable to deadly. During one particularly violent storm, the terrified crew witnessed an extraordinary electrical phenomenon that would be interpreted as divine intervention in their desperate struggle against the forces of nature. Strange lights appeared to dance along their ship's masts and rigging, creating an eerie glow that illuminated the darkness surrounding their vessels. The mysterious electrical display seemed to respond to the storm's intensity, growing brighter when lightning struck nearby and dimming during brief moments of relative calm between the most violent wind gusts. Meteorological research completed in 2025 has provided scientific explanations for the St. Elmo's fire phenomenon that Magellan's crew experienced during their Atlantic crossing. The electrical displays result from atmospheric conditions that create ionized gas around pointed objects during thunderstorms, particularly at sea where metal ship components can attract and conduct electrical charges. The research shows that St. Elmo's fire occurs most frequently near the equator, where atmospheric pressure changes and electrical activity combine to produce the ghostly lights that sailors have reported for centuries. Modern science confirms that these displays pose no direct danger to ships or crew members despite their dramatic appearance and association with severe weather conditions. The crew interpreted these electrical displays as divine approval for their mission and proof that God supported their efforts to spread Christianity to distant lands where European influence had never reached. Catholic sailors viewed the lights as confirmation that their expedition served holy purposes that transcended the political conflicts between Spain and Portugal. The phenomenon convinced many crew members that supernatural forces were protecting their ships during the dangerous Atlantic crossing and guiding them towards success in their quest to find western passages to Asian markets. Religious fervor replaced some of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued the expedition since departing Spanish waters. Antonio Pigafetta and Duarte Barbosa, both serving as chroniclers aboard the expedition, documented the crew's reactions to these extraordinary phenomena and the various challenges that threatened their progress toward the American coast. Pigafetta recorded daily observations about weather conditions, navigation techniques, crew morale, and the electrical displays that sailors interpreted through the lens of Christian theology and maritime superstition. His writings provide the most comprehensive contemporary account of the expedition's Atlantic crossing and demonstrate how religious conviction helped maintain crew unity despite mounting tensions between Spanish and Portuguese members of the expedition. The crew's religious fervor intensified as they interpreted their survival through dangerous storms as evidence that their mission to spread Christianity justified the risks they were taking and the hardships they were enduring. Spanish and Portuguese sailors united in their shared Catholic faith, despite their national differences and conflicting loyalties regarding Magellan's leadership. Religious ceremonies became more frequent as the expedition progressed, with daily prayers and weekly masses providing structure and comfort during the uncertain weeks of ocean crossing. The crew's Christian identity helped bridge some of the cultural and linguistic barriers that had divided the multinational expedition since its formation in Spanish ports. Research conducted in 2025 has revealed sophisticated navigation techniques that 16th century sailors used during their Atlantic crossing, including celestial observations, dead reckoning calculations, and environmental indicators that helped them maintain their course despite primitive instruments and limited maps. The updated research shows that Magellan's navigators possessed more advanced skills than previously recognized by historians who underestimated the technical knowledge required for successful ocean exploration during this period. The expedition's successful Atlantic crossing brought temporary relief from immediate dangers, while creating new challenges that would test Magellan's leadership in ways that storms and superstition could never match. As the 5 ships approached the South American coast, the Portuguese commander faced the daunting task of maintaining discipline among men whose loyalty remained questionable and whose patience with hardship was approaching its limits. The winter of betrayal at Port St. Julian. Magellan's fleet reached the desolate shores of Port St. Julian in March 1520, arriving at what would become the stage for the most violent confrontation of their entire expedition. The barren Patagonian coastline offered little comfort to 270 men who expected to find supplies and shelter after months of difficult ocean travel. Instead, they discovered a windswept bay surrounded by rocky cliffs and sparse vegetation that provided minimal protection from the harsh South American elements. The port's isolation meant no indigenous settlements could offer trade opportunities or fresh provisions that might have improved crew morale during their extended stay. The brutal South American winter descended upon the expedition with a ferocity that trapped the men in conditions far worse than anything they had experienced during their Atlantic crossing. Temperatures plummeted below freezing while fierce winds howled across the exposed harbor where their 5 ships lay anchored. Ice formed on rigging and deck surfaces, making routine maintenance dangerous and exhausting work that required constant attention to prevent equipment damage. The crew huddled in cramped quarters below deck, where condensation from their breathing created damp conditions that encouraged disease and made rest nearly impossible. Food supplies dwindled rapidly as the expedition faced 5 months of forced inactivity while waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for safe travel. The original provisions calculated for their voyage had not anticipated such an extended stay in a location where hunting and foraging produced minimal results. Sailors watched their daily rations shrink to barely sustenance levels, while officers debated whether to continue the expedition or return to Spain before complete starvation became inevitable. The combination of hunger, cold, and uncertainty about their future created perfect conditions for the crew's simmering resentments to explode into open rebellion. Growing desperation and hunger fueled mutinous thoughts among Spanish crew members who had never fully accepted Magellan's Portuguese leadership and now blamed him for their desperate situation. Sailors gathered in small groups to discuss their conviction that Magellan had led them into a death trap through his obsession with finding a western passage that might not even exist. The Spanish captains who had opposed Magellan from the beginning found eager audiences for their arguments that Portuguese incompetence was responsible for their current suffering. Crew members began to believe that removing Magellan from command represented their only chance of survival and safe return to European civilization. archaeological excavations at Port St. Julian have revealed extensive evidence of the Spanish encampment and the dramatic events that unfolded during their winter stay. Ground-penetrating radar has identified the locations of temporary shelters constructed by the crew, along with weapon fragments, pottery shards, and tools that provide insights into their daily activities and survival strategies. The archaeological discoveries help reconstruct the interactions between Magellan's men and the indigenous Tehuelche people who occasionally approached their camp. The excavation site also contains physical evidence related to the violent mutiny that nearly destroyed the expedition during Easter 1520. The Easter Day Mutiny erupted on March 31, 1520, when Spanish captains Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis Mendoza launched their long-planned assault on Magellan's authority. The mutineers covered their faces with charcoal to disguise their identities and launched coordinated attacks designed to seize control of 3 ships in Magellan's 5-vessel fleet. The rebels moved swiftly to capture the San Antonio along with 2 other vessels, effectively gaining numerical superiority over Magellan's remaining loyal forces. The mutineers accused Magellan of endangering the entire expedition through his reckless pursuit of an impossible mission that would result in the deaths of all 270 crew members. Magellan responded to the mutiny with cunning counterattacks that used disguised marines to infiltrate rebel positions and turn the tide of battle in his favor. He deployed loyal soldiers who pretended to support the mutineers while secretly working to undermine their control over captured vessels. The Portuguese commander's military experience from his service in Portuguese colonies enabled him to outmaneuver the Spanish captains who had underestimated his tactical abilities and determination to maintain command. Magellan's strategic thinking allowed him to recapture the remaining 2 vessels and force the mutineers to surrender their positions after realizing their rebellion had failed. The brutal executions that followed demonstrated Magellan's absolute determination to prevent future challenges to his authority through extreme displays of violent punishment. Gaspar de Quesada was beheaded on April 7, exactly 1 week after the Easter Mutiny, in a public ceremony designed to terrorize any remaining crew members who might consider rebellion. The bodies of both Quesada and Luis Mendoza were strung up and displayed for 3 full months as gruesome reminders of the consequences awaiting anyone who dared challenge Portuguese leadership. The public display of mutineers' corpses created a psychological atmosphere of fear that effectively ended organized resistance to Magellan's command. The violence at Port St. Julian established Magellan's absolute authority over his expedition through terror tactics that eliminated organized opposition to his leadership while demonstrating his willingness to use extreme measures to maintain discipline. The executions and public display of corpses sent clear messages to surviving crew members about the consequences of challenging Portuguese command or questioning the expedition's continuation toward their original objectives. Spanish sailors who had previously plotted against Magellan now understood that their survival depended on obedience and cooperation rather than resistance. With discipline restored through fear and winter finally ending, the 4 remaining ships prepared to resume their search for the elusive Western Passage that had consumed so many lives and resources. The Strait Discovery and final desertion. The crew spotted Cape Virgenis at 52 degrees south on October 21, 1520, where the expedition would finally discover the passage that had consumed the Portuguese navigators' dreams for over a decade. The rocky headlands jutted into the Atlantic Ocean like ancient sentinels guarding secrets that no European had ever penetrated. Fierce winds battered the coastline, while massive waves crashed against jagged cliffs that seemed to offer no possibility of safe passage toward the Western Ocean that Magellan believed lay beyond the American continent. The crew stared at the forbidding landscape and wondered whether their commander had led them to another dead end that would force them to abandon their mission and return to Spain in failure. After 3 days of storms, the Trinidad and Concepcion were pushed into what appeared to be a narrow bay surrounded by towering cliffs on both sides. The ship's crews expected to find themselves trapped in a dead-end inlet that would require dangerous maneuvering to escape without running aground on hidden rocks or sandbars. Instead, the storm-driven vessels discovered that the narrow opening continued westward between steep canyon walls that created a natural corridor through the continental landmass. The accidental discovery revealed the entrance to the passage that Spanish explorers had been seeking since Vasco Núñez de Balboa first glimpsed the Pacific Ocean from a Panamanian mountaintop 7 years earlier. The careful navigation through this treacherous 350-mile waterway tested every aspect of the crew's seamanship and courage as they encountered conditions unlike anything in their previous maritime experience. The Straits' narrow channels forced the ships to sail in single file, while navigating between rocky outcroppings that could destroy their hulls if wind or current pushed them off course. Unpredictable tidal currents created whirlpools and standing waves that threatened to drive the vessels into cliff faces or onto submerged obstacles that appeared without warning. The towering canyon walls blocked sunlight for hours at a time, while creating wind patterns that shifted direction suddenly and made sail management extremely dangerous for crew members working in the rigging. Geological research conducted in 2025 has explained the complex formation processes that created the Straits' unique characteristics and the natural dangers that made navigation so treacherous for 16th-century sailing vessels. The research shows that glacial activity during multiple ice ages carved the channel through solid rock, while tectonic forces created the steep-walled fjords that characterize much of the passage. Ocean currents flowing between the Atlantic and Pacific create powerful undertows and surface turbulence that can overwhelm small vessels attempting to maintain their intended course. The geological studies reveal that the Straits formation involved catastrophic flooding events that sculpted the landscape over thousands of years and created the navigational hazards that Magellan's expedition encountered during their passage. The mysterious disappearance of the San Antonio during the Strait exploration created immediate concerns about the ship's fate and the safety of its 55 crew members who had vanished without explanation while scouting ahead of the main fleet. Magellan ordered extensive search operations that sent boats into every side channel and inlet where the missing vessel might have sought shelter from adverse weather conditions. The searches revealed no trace of wreckage or crew members that would indicate the ship had been destroyed by the treacherous conditions within the strait. Days passed without any signal fires or other communications that would suggest the San Antonio's crew was stranded somewhere along the passage and needed rescue assistance from their companion vessels. Evidence discovered in Spanish archives and analyzed using 2025 digital restoration techniques reveals that the San Antonio's disappearance resulted from deliberate desertion rather than accidental destruction or navigational error. The newly examined documents show that Captain Alvaro de Mesquita had been replaced by Estevao Gomez, who convinced the crew to abandon the expedition and return to Spain rather than continue following Magellan toward uncertain death in unknown waters. Letters written by deserting crew members describe their conviction that Magellan's obsession with finding a western passage would result in the destruction of the entire expedition and the death of all 270 original participants. The correspondence reveals that the deserters believed they were saving their own lives by abandoning their Portuguese commander and returning to Spanish territory where they could report on the expedition's progress. The 3 remaining ships continued through the strait despite losing nearly 1/5 of their total crew strength and valuable supplies that had been stored aboard the deserting vessel. Magellan refused to abandon his mission, even though the San Antonio's desertion meant reduced manpower for handling the dangerous navigation required to complete their passage through the treacherous waterway. The remaining crew members faced increased workloads and greater personal risk as they struggled to manage 3 ships with insufficient personnel while dealing with the strait's challenging conditions. They dipped water to find constant salt content, confirming the outlet to the Western Sea. The crew's joy upon reaching the Pacific Ocean on November 28, 1520, represented the emotional climax of their struggle through the strait and the fulfillment of Magellan's decade-long dream of finding a western passage to Asian markets. Magellan wept openly as he stood on the Trinidad's deck and gazed across the calm waters that he named Mar Pacifico because of their peaceful appearance after the violent conditions his expedition had endured during their Atlantic crossing and strait passage. The tears represented his triumph over the Portuguese officials who had rejected his western route proposal and vindicated his conviction that Spain could reach Asian markets without using established Portuguese trade networks. The 3 ships sailed into what appeared to be a tranquil ocean that promised easier sailing ahead, but the crew had no understanding of the vast distances that separated them from their Asian destination. The Pacific Ocean revealed its true nature as the world's largest body of water, stretching far beyond every calculation that European navigators had made about the distance between America and Asia. The 3 remaining ships entered this vast expanse on November 28, 1520, with crews celebrating their discovery of the Western Passage and anticipating a relatively short journey to the profitable Spice Islands. The ocean's deceptively calm surface had inspired Magellan to name it the Pacific, meaning peaceful, after the violent storms and treacherous conditions they had endured during their Atlantic crossing and passage through the strait. The 215 surviving crew members expected to reach Asian markets within weeks, based on their limited understanding of global geography and calculations that drastically underestimated the distance between the American coast and the islands where Portuguese traders had established their lucrative spice operations. European maps available in 1520 showed Asia positioned much closer to the American continent than reality, leading Magellan's navigators to believe they would encounter land within a month of entering Pacific waters. Instead, they sailed through an endless blue void that stretched beyond every horizon while their supplies diminished and hopes for quick relief faded into growing desperation. The ocean's immensity exceeded every estimate and challenged fundamental assumptions about Earth's size that had guided European exploration planning. Week after week passed without relief as their ships continued westward through waters that seemed to contain no end and no salvation from their deteriorating situation. Their 99-day crossing transformed into a nightmare of gradual starvation as the expedition encountered nothing but empty oceans stretching endlessly in every direction they looked. The crew scanned the horizon daily for any sign of land or vegetation that might indicate approaching islands where they could find fresh water, edible plants, or friendly inhabitants willing to trade food for European goods. The psychological impact of sailing through apparently infinite emptiness began to affect crew morale and decision-making capabilities as men realized they might die before reaching any destination. Nutritional analysis conducted in 2025 has revealed the horrifying details of the crew's deteriorating diet as their food supplies rotted, became infested with vermin, or simply ran out entirely during their extended Pacific crossing. The research shows that sailors consumed fewer than 800 calories per day during the final weeks of their ocean crossing, approximately half the minimum required for men performing the physical labor necessary to operate sailing ships. Protein deficiency became acute as preserved meat supplies spoiled and fishing efforts produced minimal results in the deep ocean waters far from coastal feeding areas where marine life concentrated. The horror of their situation became evident in their desperation to consume anything remotely edible. According to Pigafetta's records, they ate ship biscuits that had become powder of biscuits swarming with worms, for they had eaten the good. It stank strongly of the urine of rats, but represented the only carbohydrate source available to prevent complete starvation. Sailors scraped sawdust from wooden ship components and mixed it with water to create a paste that provided some sensation of eating while delivering no nutritional value. They boiled ox hides cut from rigging and equipment covers, chewing the softened material for hours to extract whatever nutrients might exist in processed animal leather. Medical records discovered in Spanish archives and analyzed using 2025 digital restoration techniques describe scurvy's devastating effects on crew members who had been deprived of fresh fruits and vegetables for months during their Pacific crossing. The disease caused sailors' gums to swell and bleed while their teeth loosened and eventually fell out, making eating even their limited food supplies extremely painful and difficult. Open sores appeared on their skin and refused to heal while old wounds reopened as their bodies lost the ability to maintain healthy tissue. Many crew members could barely walk or perform basic tasks as scurvy weakened their muscles and joints to the point of near-complete disability. The crew's skeletal appearance shocked even their companions as starvation reduced grown men to walking skeletons whose clothes hung loose on frames depleted by months of inadequate nutrition. Sailors who had been robust and healthy when departing Spain now resembled concentration camp survivors with protruding ribs, sunken cheeks, and arms so thin that their bones were clearly visible beneath translucent skin. Their desperate hunt for rats aboard ship became a daily obsession as these rodents represented the only source of fresh meat available during their Pacific ordeal. Men paid premium prices using their personal possessions to purchase rats from other crew members who had been lucky enough to catch them in improvised traps constructed from ship materials. Starvation began driving men toward madness, as their brains were deprived of the glucose and nutrients necessary for normal cognitive function and emotional regulation. Crew members reported hallucinations of food and land that appeared and disappeared like mirages on the endless ocean horizon. Some sailors became obsessed with elaborate fantasies about meals they would eat upon returning to Europe, while others grew violent and unpredictable as hunger affected their ability to think rationally. The psychological deterioration created discipline problems as officers struggled to maintain order among men whose judgment had been compromised by prolonged malnutrition. Research conducted in 2025 has revealed how specific Pacific wind patterns trapped Magellan's expedition in areas where consistent trade winds pushed them steadily westward without providing opportunities to alter course toward potentially inhabited islands. The updated meteorological analysis shows that their route took them through portions of the Pacific where seasonal wind patterns created natural highways that prevented deviation from their westward trajectory. Ocean current research demonstrates that surface currents reinforced the wind patterns to create conditions where the ships had limited ability to explore alternative routes that might have led them to populated islands sooner. Their salvation finally arrived when they reached Guam on March 6, 1521, after 99 days of Pacific hell that had reduced their numbers and brought the survivors to the edge of death from starvation and disease. The brief respite at Guam provided desperately needed fresh food and water, but Magellan's ambitions drove the expedition onward toward what he believed would be their ultimate destination in the profitable Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. The Philippines and Enrique's secret. The expedition found their first glimpse of salvation when they reached Homonhon Island on March 16, 1521, carrying 150 emaciated survivors who had endured 99 days of starvation and disease during their Pacific crossing. The islands appeared like a vision of paradise to men who had consumed rat meat and leather soup while sailing through seemingly endless ocean. Palm trees swayed along pristine beaches while smoke from cooking fires indicated human habitation and the possibility of food, fresh water, and rest that could save their lives. The crew prepared their weapons and trade goods while approaching cautiously, uncertain whether the inhabitants would welcome European visitors or attack them as invaders threatening their territory. The first contact between Europeans and Filipino peoples occurred when small boats filled with curious islanders from Suluan paddled out to investigate the strange vessels that had appeared in their waters. The Filipinos examined the European ships with obvious amazement, while the Spanish sailors stared back at people whose appearance, clothing, and boats differed completely from anything in their previous experience. Both groups maintained careful distances while attempting to communicate through gestures and simple words that might establish peaceful intentions. The initial meetings proceeded without violence as each side evaluated the other's capabilities and motivations through cautious exchanges of basic trade items. Enrique stepped forward during these tentative negotiations and spoke directly to the Filipino visitors in words they immediately understood. The enslaved interpreter, who had remained silent during months of Pacific suffering, suddenly became the vital communication link between two civilizations meeting for the first time. His fluent conversation with the islanders shocked every European observer, who realized that their Portuguese commander's personal slave possessed linguistic abilities that transformed him from property into the expedition's most valuable asset. The moment marked a dramatic reversal in Enrique's status from powerless captive to essential negotiator, whose skills determined whether the expedition would find salvation or destruction. Linguistic analysis conducted in 2025 has provided compelling evidence supporting theories about Enrique's Filipino origins that challenge traditional assumptions about his background and significance. The analysis examines vocabulary patterns, grammatical structures, and pronunciation characteristics recorded in historical documents that describe Enrique's conversations with Filipino inhabitants. Researchers have identified linguistic markers that suggest Enrique spoke languages native to the Philippine Islands rather than the Malaysian dialects that Portuguese records attributed to him. The linguistic evidence indicates that Enrique may have been captured during raids on Philippine coastal communities and transported to Malacca's slave markets, along with other captives from distant islands. The shocking realization dawned on expedition members that Enrique might be communicating with people from his own homeland after years of enslavement thousands of miles from his birthplace. Portuguese and Spanish observers watched as Enrique engaged in animated conversations that suggested familiarity with local customs, geography, and social structures that extended beyond simple linguistic competence. His emotional reactions during these interactions hinted at personal connections that transcended his role as a translator serving European masters. The possibility that chance had brought Enrique back to his origins after years of forced servitude added profound irony to the expedition's arrival in the Philippines. Magellan launched aggressive Christian conversion campaigns immediately upon establishing peaceful relations with Filipino leaders who welcomed the Europeans as potential allies against rival communities. The Portuguese commander interpreted Filipino hospitality as divine providence that facilitated his mission to spread Christianity throughout the pagan territories that European explorers encountered. He organized mass baptism ceremonies that converted hundreds of Filipinos to Christianity within days of their first contact with European religious practices. Magellan viewed these religious conversions as validation of his expedition's holy purpose and proof that God supported Spanish expansion into previously unknown regions of the world. Enrique's translation abilities made these mass baptisms possible by enabling Magellan to communicate complex religious concepts to Filipino audiences who had never encountered Christian theology or European cultural practices. The enslaved interpreter explained Catholic doctrines, ritual requirements, and moral obligations that accompanied conversion while serving as the bridge between two completely different worldviews. His linguistic skills allowed Magellan to conduct religious ceremonies that appeared meaningful to Filipino participants despite their limited understanding of the theological foundations underlying Christian practices. Research conducted in 2025 suggests that if Enrique indeed returned to the region before Victoria's arrival, he may have been the first person to circle the globe by completing a journey that began in the Philippines, continued to Europe with Magellan's earlier expeditions, and returned to his homeland during the Spanish circumnavigation attempt. This interpretation would make the enslaved Filipino, rather than any European explorer, the first person to travel completely around the Earth by ocean routes. The research challenges traditional narratives that credit European explorers with achieving the first circumnavigation, while ignoring the contributions of non-European participants whose experiences and knowledge made such voyages possible. The growing tension between Magellan's imperial ambitions and Filipino resistance became evident as local leaders began questioning European demands for political submission and religious conversion. Filipino chiefs, who had initially welcomed the Spanish visitors, grew concerned about Magellan's increasingly aggressive attempts to establish permanent European control over their territories. The Portuguese commander's insistence that Filipino communities accept Spanish sovereignty and abandon their traditional religious practices created conflicts that threatened the peaceful relationships established during initial contact. Local resistance movements began forming as Filipino leaders recognized that European friendship came with unacceptable costs to their political independence and cultural autonomy. While Magellan would die on April 27, 1521, Juan Sebastián Elcano would complete the circumnavigation aboard the Victoria, reaching Spain on September 6, 1522. Charles I granted Elcano a noble title and pension documented in 1523 royal decrees, recognizing his achievement in completing the first documented circumnavigation. However, Magellan's determination to establish Spanish authority over Filipino communities would soon provoke a confrontation that would test European assumptions about their military superiority against indigenous resistance. The Battle of Mactan and Magellan's death. Chief Lapu of Mactan Island delivered his defiant response to Magellan's demand for conversion and submission with words that would echo through history as one of the first acts of organized resistance against European colonialism in Southeast Asia. The Filipino leader rejected both Christianity and Spanish political authority, while making it clear that his people would fight to defend their traditional beliefs and independence. Lapu understood that accepting Magellan's demands would mean surrendering control over his territory and people to foreign invaders who had arrived uninvited in Philippine waters. His refusal represented not just personal defiance, but a strategic decision to resist European expansion before it could establish permanent footholds in his region. Magellan made the fatal decision to personally lead a military assault on Mactan Island, rather than accepting diplomatic failure, and moving on to other territories where Filipino leaders had proven more receptive to Spanish influence. The Portuguese commander's pride and religious fervor convinced him that European military superiority would easily overcome local resistance, regardless of numerical disadvantages his forces might face. He believed that a decisive victory over Lapu would demonstrate Spanish power to other Filipino communities and discourage future resistance to European authority. Magellan's decision to participate directly in the battle, rather than directing operations from his ship, revealed the personal nature of his conflict with a defiant Filipino chief. The beach battle that erupted on April 27, 1521, pitted approximately 49 heavily armed Europeans against around 1,500 Filipino warriors who had prepared defensive positions along Mactan's shoreline. Magellan's forces carried muskets, crossbows, steel swords, and metal armor that represented the most advanced military technology available to European armies. The Filipino defenders wielded bamboo spears, hardwood clubs, stone-tipped arrows, and fire-hardened wooden shields that seemed primitive compared to European weapons, but proved devastatingly effective in the hands of skilled warriors fighting on familiar terrain. The numerical disparity meant that each European soldier faced roughly 30 Filipino opponents in combat conditions that favored local knowledge over technological advantages. The Mactan warriors used their knowledge of the shallow waters to their advantage, preventing the Spanish ships from providing effective cannon support. Filipino fighters deliberately drew the European forces into positions where their vessels' cannons could not reach, neutralizing one of Spain's primary military advantages. The shallow coral reefs and tidal patterns that local warriors understood intimately became tactical weapons that trapped Magellan's men in a killing zone where their technological superiority meant nothing. Ferdinand Magellan fell during the height of the battle, when a bamboo spear thrust by a Filipino warrior ended the life of the man who had dreamed of western passages to Asian riches. According to Pigafetta's account, Magellan and his 60 men were forced to wade through knee-deep water to reach the shore, where harsh tides had prevented their boats from landing closer to the beach. The spear penetrated between the plates of his armor and inflicted wounds that proved fatal despite his soldiers' desperate attempts to protect their commander and retreat to safety. The Portuguese explorer who had survived storms, mutinies, and starvation during his epic voyage died within sight of his vessels, but beyond the reach of rescue by his remaining crew members. The Europeans' desperate retreat from Mactan Beach became a chaotic rout as surviving soldiers abandoned their wounded commander and fled toward their boats under intense pressure from pursuing Filipino warriors. Spanish soldiers who had expected easy victory over primitive opponents found themselves overwhelmed by disciplined fighters who had turned the beach into a killing ground where European military advantages became liabilities. The retreating Europeans left behind weapons, armor, and equipment along with Magellan's body, which remained in Filipino hands as a trophy of their successful resistance. Research conducted in 2025 has revealed the sophisticated tactical brilliance that Lapu demonstrated during his victory over Magellan's forces through careful analysis of battlefield archaeology and Filipino historical traditions. The research shows that Lapu deliberately chose the battle location to maximize his numerical advantages while minimizing European strengths in firepower and mobility. His tactical plan included using shallow water to prevent Spanish ships from approaching close enough to provide cannon support, while positioning his warriors to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The expedition's leadership crisis emerged immediately after Magellan's death, as surviving officers struggled to establish new command structures while dealing with the psychological impact of their commander's defeat. Spanish captains Duarte Barbosa and Juan Serrano assumed joint leadership, but lacked Magellan's authority and experience in managing the complex political and practical challenges facing the expedition. The leadership vacuum created opportunities for previously suppressed tensions and conflicts to resurface among crew members who had different opinions about how to proceed with their mission. Enrique recognized that Magellan's death provided his first real opportunity for freedom since his enslavement years earlier in Malacca slave markets, but the new Spanish commanders refused to honor any promises of liberation that Magellan might have made to his personal interpreter. This decision would prove catastrophic for the expedition's remaining leadership and raise profound questions about whose achievements history chooses to remember. The true cost of this historic voyage was only beginning to reveal itself. Enrique's disappearance from historical records after Magellan's death leaves us with one of exploration's most tantalizing mysteries. The devastating toll of the first circumnavigation reveals the extraordinary price paid for this historic achievement. Only 18 survivors out of 270 original crew members returned to Spain aboard the Victoria on September 6, 1522. This represents a survival rate of less than 7% after nearly 3 years of unimaginable hardship. The evidence suggests an extraordinary possibility that challenges everything we thought we knew about this famous voyage. Enrique of Malacca, the enslaved interpreter who traveled west with Magellan from Asia to Europe before joining the westward expedition, may have become the first person to circle the entire globe. His journey from the Philippines to Europe and back again could make him history's true first circumnavigator rather than any European explorer.